everyone. Welcome to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for novices and masters alike. I am Dan. My co-host, of course, is the Earthdawn line developer, Josh Harrison.
Good evening, everyone.
And on this podcast today, we'll be discussing all things both magical and mechanical. Today, I think actually whimsical and chronological a little bit there. I'm going to just keep that trope going as long as I possibly can. We haven't had any email in a while, but if you have a question for us or comments or just a thumbs up for us, we'll take that as well. Please email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Any opening remarks there, Josh, or we'll just dive right into it?
Well, yeah, and of course, as always, if you haven't, rate and review the show on your podcast platform of choice, because those sorts of things are always good to see. We got a little wave of feedback. So yeah, like, share, subscribe, blah, blah, blah.
Absolutely. So as a holdover from last episode, we had a question actually from the great founder, Lou Prosperi, asked us a question about some derived stats and the attribute breaking points, and if people are striving to get there on the initial character creation.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
We didn't get too much into this in the last episode because we were focused more on what the various attributes did more and who they were more or less important for when it came to creating a character. But the values range typically from for the attribute values range from the sort of 3 to 18 range that you see from a typical D&D style game, but bonuses or penalties can certainly put a little bit outside that range. But those scores are what basically determine what your various derived stats are: your defense ratings, your health ratings, and all of those various other values that we talked about in relation to the different attributes. And one of the other things that we didn't get into, I had talked about you want your primary attribute to be a step 7 generally when you're creating the character, and if you can get a second one there, or as as high into step 6 as possible, so you can get it to a step 7 with attribute raises. Those are fairly standard. But another thing to look at when you are building your character and deciding what points to do is to look at what the point score gets you in terms of those derived values. For example, if you can't get to the step, you might, to a new step, you might see that there's a breakpoint where if you take it 1 point lower or higher, you might hit an increase on a defense rating, or you might see your wound threshold from your toughness go up, or get an additional recovery test. And the break points for those generally fall in around the sort of 13 to 15 range in the score, depending on exactly what it is that you're looking at. And so that is something that you can play with, and why in general I tend to have characters that their sort of additional stats all tend to end up like around in the 13 to 14 range, because then they're close to getting those boosts. So it's something to keep in mind. It is certainly a valid approach to maybe not be concerned with anything at all in terms of those derived stats if the attribute itself isn't important for your character's talent abilities. But it is something else that you can look at when you are putting your character together.
Yeah. I've had one of my players once upon a time specifically devise his stats to end up at that break point, where he's like, first 800 points I get, I'm doing an attribute increase so that I can get my toughness up and change a whole bunch of numbers all in one shot, because it's cheaper for him to do that than it was to build the character differently. And so he found the min-max level. It's I don't think quite as... Because we changed a little bit the way those derived stats are calculated for 4th edition, it's not quite as blatant in some places as it was in earlier editions. I think I remember like the score of 14 was like the break point for so many things in earlier editions. And yeah, it certainly might have been better to, I'll take my toughness at 1 point lower than would perhaps be ideal, but the extra 2 points of build that I get out of that, I will put into this, which will get me a little bit of a higher
do like social defense, and then I'll just like use some of my early legend points to raise the attribute. That is certainly something to look at as well, but that gets into advancement, and it was definitely not something that we were really looking at in terms of our broader discussion of character creation. That starts getting into a little bit more advanced theory crafting, where you have a much better idea of what you're going to be doing and what you're going to be shooting for.
And that's a whole nother show,
yeah,
like a year from now, if ever. Yeah, so hopefully that answers Lou's question. I've had some people try and do it. I think you've smoothed it out in 4th edition, and shouldn't be as crunchy as it was before.
Well,
so,
it's still crunchy. Or, you know, that is not something that was ever like in the cards to like reduce the game, the overall level of crunch in the game at all.
Yeah,
you know, that the derived stats were, I mean, I'm sure there was a method to the way they were done in the original edition, but the formulas or calculations were not obvious or sort of relatively
consistent.
quickly well. I think they were consistent in a certain way that was not intuitive. In much
that's a good way to put that.
Yeah, in much the same way that like the original success level table did not have a like immediately obvious and consistent way that like an excellent success is always double the target number. That didn't happen because I think it was based on the actual underlying percentages and how the curves changed with increasing step numbers and stuff like that. And while it was beautifully created math-wise, it's, you know, I think there is a point where you can like get a little bit overindulgent in that. And potentially, I don't think it was really the case in Earth Dawn, but potentially just from a general game design standpoint, lose some playability as a result of getting too much in love with the underlying numbers.
Fair enough. Like analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
Something like that. So, which actually does bring us to one of our other topics for today. We've got 4 topics. We were going to talk about the nature of the success levels in 4th edition versus the other editions, and perhaps bring up the wonderful beauty that is karma.
Yeah,
kind of a holdover from Shadowrun.
Yeah, this is I think going to end up being a little bit more of a why I made the choices that I did when laying out the updates to 4th edition.
Fair.
Just because from a sort of discussion standpoint, there's not a whole lot to say about the rules themselves. They're relatively straightforward. In 4th edition, so to go back actually, in 1st edition, you know, in addition to the really basic mechanic of you roll your step dice and you want to equal or exceed the target number, there were a number of places within the mechanics where not only did was that not only the only thing you were looking for, you also, in some situations, were interested in how much you beat the target number by. Most notoriously or most famously with armor defeating hits, which was to say if you rolled high enough over your opponent's physical defense, it would ignore armor. It didn't matter how much they had. It was
just bypass it. You found a chink or
whatever, and it would just defeat the armor entirely. But there were other cases where that would happen. Like for example, in thread weaving for casting spells, if you got if you got an excellent success on a thread weaving test, and there were additional threads remaining to be woven, you would get an extra thread when you did that. So there was basically a full page chart in the original book that basically showed for each target number what the targets effectively for the various result levels were. Like, for example, against, and they were, there was average, which was basically hitting the target number, good, excellent, and extraordinary. And so, generally speaking, average was the target number. Good was a little bit above it. excellent, typically, at least in the lower target numbers, was about double. So a difficulty 9, for example, an 18, because 9 was such a common physical defense, knowing the 18 was the armor defeating hit, for example.
Yep.
But that did not hold true as you got into higher target numbers, because that was all based, like I said earlier, off of the curves of the steps where that was the average result. So the good, excellent, extraordinary result levels were based off of like what the percentage chance was to get that number or better when rolling that step. So if you were rolling a step 9, it was about a 50% chance to get an average. I think it was like a 20% chance for a good, like an 8% chance for excellent, and like a 3% chance for extraordinary. Roughly speaking, when you kind of like calculated out and I did the work on this, because I was a total dork back in the 90s. I mean, I'm still a dork now, but like
I was going to say, yes,
this was like my first big analysis, and I've got an article up about it and whatnot. But anyway, basically, once you got into the multiple
6-page article, yeah.
Once you got into the multiple die steps and you calculated out, what the percentages are, and you sort of graphed them out, that was roughly what it came out to be, which was why the numbers kind of were the way they were, because it was based on these bell curves rather than just like looking at the number. Anyway, because especially as you got into higher target numbers, the numbers weren't quite as intuitive as they were, because most people, for the most part, you weren't really concerned with good success. It was always the excellent success you were looking for.
Yes,
that double for the armor defeating hit or the extra threat and whatnot. And the good and extraordinary successes were, generally speaking, not as important, although there were some talents that would like change your armor defeating hit from an excellent to a good, or the hardened armor, for example, for dragons and some other creatures would change the armor defeating hit from them for excellent to extraordinary. There were some things that like played around with that one way or the other. Anyway, it also would cap out at extraordinary, regardless of how well you might have rolled. If you were just doing like an action test, like an attack roll or something, as opposed to a damage roll, where obviously the higher you get, the better it is. But once you broke that extraordinary threshold, if it was something that even mattered, it didn't matter how much farther you went beyond that. In 4th edition, we basically decided to kind of change the approach to that slightly, and to take a page a little bit from the from Deadlands, Savage Worlds, and similar games that have what are colloquially called, I think in a lot of cases, raises, where if you get certain fixed amounts over the target number, then they provide you bonuses. And while mathematically most of the time you're not going to end up with the like super duper high rolls, they do show up, and by opening up and open ending not only the die results itself, but the number of successes, it just allowed a lot more play. And then calculating that, okay, each of these successes, would basically have an effect based on what you were doing. And so essentially the general rule was, okay, well, what do you use as the target, as the basis for that? And multiples of 5 are really easy to work with, even if maybe mathematically it's not quite as elegant as, like, I know Savage Worlds, for example, does it in multiples of 4. Like, their base target number for success is 4, and each 4 beyond that is a raise. Multiples of 4 are not quite as simple to deal with, like, in the heat of the moment necessarily, as you are in, like, multiples of 5, because then you can get 10s and it's kind of easy to figure out how that goes. Yeah. And then basically from that going, okay, we're going to have this, we're going to do away with the, like, all or nothing armor defeating hit. And we'll talk about this more in a later episode when we get into the more basics of combat. But basically, what's the multiple of, like, each... If we're going to have, like, the basic foundation is, okay, each success will have an effect. What is that effect going to be for combat when you're trying to hit somebody? Like, okay, well, it's going to do extra damage. What's the value that we should choose for that extra damage? And just looking at a bunch of things and saying, okay, 2s a lot of stuff people will notice if you're looking at it is in multiples of 2, because that is also really easy to work with in terms of numbers. Counting by 2s is pretty straightforward. And it also turns out that, okay, well, what that does is it makes the sort of old-fashioned extraordinary or excellent success effectively a full armor defeating hit against, leather, hardened leather, like most armors, or gets through a lot of the armor value of the most common armors that people are going to be having. But it allows the heavier armors to at least continue to have some value. So that was like the original sort of basis of that, and then everything kind of spun on from there, going, okay, we're going to be dealing with multiples of 5, we're going to be dealing with multiples of 2, because those are relatively easy numbers to deal with, and then just figuring out where to fit it in from there. And I think it works pretty well overall. It does run into the slight issue that if you're going with the traditional method of modifying the step based on like modifiers, that if you are normally rolling a step 9 and you get a +2 bonus, you're going to be rolling a step 11. It does mean that you're going to need to be looking at your step chart and changing your dice more often. It's a trade-off.
That's a nice problem to have.
Yeah,
personally,
it's okay. And I certainly think that for the most part, if people would much prefer to have those sorts of things be just flat modifiers to the die roll, it's okay. It's not 100% the way the system was designed, but for small modifiers, it's not that big a deal. The larger
+1 or +2,
the larger the modifier is, the more of an effect it's actually going to have. And I'm not going to bother getting into the weeds on like what it does probability wise and all that sort of thing. But that
requires charts, and this is an audio.
Yeah, that requires charts and discussion and people who actually enjoy getting into the weeds on probability math and stuff like that.
So engineers, no.
Yeah, engineer, and maybe I'll make a video about it someday. Just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about when I get into that stuff. But that's the basic gist of it. You have a target number. Every 5 points over, every full 5 points over is an additional success, and the rules generally tell you what each success does. For the most part, and that's pretty straightforward. So that if it's like if the target number is a 10 and they roll a 19, they're 10 over, so that's 2 successes. And there are so many places where that sort of stuff comes in that we actually were able to like really enhance some of the like creature abilities and some of the knacks and stuff that we've developed later actually allow characters to spend extra successes in order to like do the stuff. So that if you roll well enough, instead of doing extra damage, you can take those extra successes and maybe like prevent a creature from flying for a round or something along those lines.
Fair.
And
go ahead.
I was going to lead into karma, but if you were going to say something else, you go right ahead.
Oh, I was going to chime in on this whole thing because my previous podcast, we had the player's guide only at this point, and we were still playing the 3rd edition or the Red Brick edition, and we were lamenting the loss of the armor defeating hits because I thought that was a great difference between that and the traditional D&D games where THAC0 is just a big hot ball of mess. And I loved Earthdawn for the armor defeating part of it, and what that actually did is just negates the armor. I just do damage to you alone. That's all there is to it. Some spells did that. It was wonderful to do against horrors and bigger creatures. But the recent sessions I've played where my character has been able to roll, 4 extra successes, and to your point, I don't want to add +4 to my damage roll. I want to go up 4 whole steps, and I want to change my dice because those to get me greater probabilities of maxing things out. Maybe get a 3rd die to throw in there. And so it's converted me over to the, okay, I can live without armor defeating hits if I get these extra bonuses along the way. And I've not played a spellcaster that way yet. Don't have one in the party we're playing, but I'm waiting to see that bear some fruit as well when we get to the spellcasting stage of, yes, you got extra successes on your thread weaving. Now you can do this and this and that. Or you got extra successes on your damage for the spell as well, so extra duration or extra rounds. So it's begun making a convert out of me just because, as you said, the chart beforehand was a little limited to go, there's only 3 levels of success past your target number. This one's unlimited, just keep counting by 5s. So it's made a convert of me.
Yeah, I have found that when the player's guide and the initial discussion and teasers of the changes for 4th edition were revealed, there were a lot of longtime fans who were unsure about what was going on, and the armor defeating hit being the big one. But I found that most people, I found that a lot of people or many people, once they have played it and seen how that new mechanic is integrated into so many different things and have played with it, have found it a little bit better. So I absolutely, like, it was not something that was done on a whim. It was, okay, here's an idea. Let's see how is it possible to make this work? And it did, I think, broadly. Obviously, there are some, trade-offs in any kind of game design, but I'm happy with the way that it came out, and it gave us design space to play with that we initially were not aware would become available. And now that it is, it's fun.
It adds some more flexibility and depth to, as you said, even the knacks, which I haven't even gotten into yet because my character's only 2nd circle in 4th edition. So it'll bear fruit later for me to see. But as with anything, with any new changes, play it. Yeah. Try it first. Try and poke holes in it and see what you come back with. So that leads us into the other half of this discussion, which is Karma.
Yes.
And there were some major changes in Karma between the 1st edition and 2nd edition with Living Room Games.
Yeah.
That edition, I
hung
my head
the Karma, I think the Karma in 2nd edition was pretty much the same as 1st edition. There might have been like some minor tweaks in terms of like how much it cost for individuals or something like that. The big change to Karma came with the 3rd edition, as I seem to recall. In 1st edition, Karma was based purely on race. And every race had a different die type that was based on what their net attribute modifier was. And also,
which I liked,
which is fine. And also the cost and how much, because it cost legend originally to buy Karma points. And like how much legend it cost to buy it and how much how much Karma you could have in total was all entirely based on your race. There was, I think, like almost every discipline, when they got to like really high circles, would get a bonus where they could add additional, like their Karma pool went up by 20 or something along those lines.
Yes.
But it was all purely based on race. The Karma per point costs were all, like, relatively speaking, really low. Like, it ranged from 5 per point for Windlings to 10 per point for Trolls and Obsidimen. And that amount of points, in the grand scheme of how much it cost to advance your character, for a new character, it was relatively significant percentage-wise. But when you consider that raising a talent from rank 1 to rank 2 costs you 200 legend points, and then and that Fibonacci series where it just gets more and more expensive over time as your character advances, the amount of points the amount of your legend points, the amount of your advancement potential that you spend on your Karma ends up being such a smaller and smaller potential, or a smaller and smaller percentage of your total spending, that it just ended up feeling to me in some ways that it was a little bit of kind of fiddly resource management. That there is certainly a place for that in certain game designs, but I have seen enough examples also where if your advancement resource is something like, if you can spend your advancement resource on something else, there are potentially some negative side effects that can come about with that. Like, the most notorious one that I can think of is from 1st edition 7th Sea, where you had a number of drama dice, which were basically D10s. But the amount of experience that you would get if I'm remembering correctly, the amount of experience that you would get at the end of a session or the end of an adventure was based on the number of unspent drama dice that you have, or how many drama dice you had left at the end of the session. And what that would do is promote people not spending those dice because they would want to save them so that they could get experience points to advance their stuff.
Well, that's just wonky.
Yeah.
Here's the thing we don't want you to use until it comes time to... No,
And now,
sorry.
now Earthdawn didn't really have that problem,
No.
but because your karma... Like, I mean, there is a connection between your legend points, which determines how you can advance, and your karma, but it ended up being such a small portion in the grand scheme of an adventurer's career, and and so forth, that it just... I don't know. It's just a little weird. Third edition changed things so that everybody had the same die type for karma, and
in the same cost.
and the same cost, because it still had legend points cost. Still had karma cost legend points.
Yes.
But the size of the pool was based on the character's karma ritual talent. That is, the higher your karma ritual, the more points that you could have, which I think is a nice little thing, because the karma ritual, roughly speaking, would be about equivalent to your circle. So the higher circle you are, the larger your karma pool was. But it still had karma could only be spent on certain things, which was also something in first edition, is that you had certain talents that for certain disciplines were what were called discipline talents, which meant that for those, you had the option of spending a karma point to add in to increase the roll. And some talents required karma, which meant that if you didn't have any karma, you couldn't use it. And there was some funky confusion about, well, what if it's a discipline talent and it requires karma? That question comes up even to this day. But basically what I decided in fourth edition was the whole point. I don't really see the point of spending legend points on karma. It's a fiddly bit of bookkeeping that makes it harder in the grand scheme of things to rebuild a character if you or if you're just trying to do an audit of how much, like, to make sure that they've spent all their points correctly for their talents and whatnot. That if you are not spending any karma on legend and you are just spending karma on raising talents and weaving threads and raising attributes, it's a lot easier to go, oh, okay, you spent your points correctly, or, oh, you're 500 points short, or something like that. Whereas if you have somebody who has been spending legend on karma 1, you end up with funky totals at the end, because you're spending, especially for like to Scrang, and who had like where it costs like 6 points per, and like those kind of like mid-level, those mid-range races that had the like not 5 or 10 cost.
Yes.
And
6 and 8s were always...
And you are not keeping track of how many karma really you are spending or buying over the course of the career. So there is this gap of, maybe a couple of thousand points that just vanishes out into the ether, which again, in the grand scheme of an adept's career, is maybe not a huge amount, but it does make that kind of record keeping and auditing a little bit more wonky.
Annoying. Yes.
So I didn't really like, from a magical theory simulating the way the world works standpoint, I can understand why that would be made as a design choice. And that's fine. I completely understand the philosophy that went into a lot of the decisions in first edition Earthdawn. I know Lou is listening to this. I completely understand and respect the philosophy and the design choices that were made in that, as a way of having the rules like to actually model the metaphysics and reality of the setting. Completely understand that, and I can understand why the choice was made to have karma cost legend, and why those choices were made the way they were. But there comes a point where, for me, like I was saying earlier, you kind of maybe sometimes need to sacrifice a little of that, and I'm going to pull out the $30 word here, sacrifice a little bit of that verisimilitude of the mechanics, which is to say, the reality of the setting in order to make the gameplay a little bit easier in some respects. And so that's, that was basically the decision of, we're not going to have Karma Cost Legend anymore. We're going to keep, because we were in some ways trying to keep things on the 3rd edition design path. We're going to keep the same dice. We're still going to have the total pool based off of the character circle modified by their race, because race still does come into play. The races that have the larger net modifiers get fewer points overall, because there's a balancing aspect of the mechanic there. Gotcha. But also, we're just gonna, like, if it's a talent for your discipline, you can spend karma on it, because the ability, I think, to spend like that, the ability to spend a resource that you have to enhance your chances of success is fun. It's a cool thing, whether they're bennies or karma points or edge in Shadowrun, for the more recent editions of that, or any other, drama dice from 7th Sea. 7th Sea. Any number of things where you have the ability to spend a resource to enhance your effect when you want to, maybe do a little bit better. And because the pools, generally speaking, are smaller, like overall, actually giving people the more places to spend them actually works out well, I think, from a resource management, tactical play perspective. Is that, you can spend karma on everything, but you still only have a certain amount of them. And I certainly feel that playing a troll. As a spellcaster, I can, I've got, let's see, she's 6th circle now, so she's got 24 points of karma, and that is the daily total. And like, if things are going sideways, I can blow through those relatively quickly. Actually, we had a fight in the most recent session where we were going up against a large number of relatively weaker undead. And so I was blowing dust to dust, which is an area effect kill undead spell, and burning 2 or 3 points of karma each round just to try and get as high an effect to try and kill off, as many of these things at once.
And that sounds awesome, because after 10 or 12 runs, you're like, hey, this is great. But after 10 or 12 runs, you're like, I'm exhausted. I'm out karma. Because some fights go 10 or 12 rounds, and you're like, that's...
They certainly can. And so, the other change was that just basically, is that rather than having there be a limit to how quickly the points are restored, which was the case in earlier editions, that in 1st edition, your karma ritual rank as a talent was the maximum number of karma points that you could take per day. And so if you completely shot your wad and you drained your karma pool or very nearly, it would take some time to recover that. And I just felt that overall, with the smaller pools that are in effect and the desire from a gameplay standpoint to want people to spend them, that just refilling the pool when they, when they get up and they do their karma ritual in the morning, that is less fiddly record keeping. All you need to keep track of really is what your maximum is, and when you wake up in the day, that pool is full. And, you just keep track of it that day. You don't need to keep track of, we have a fight, I drained it, now we have 3 days of travel, so I can buy 8 points, and I need to keep track of that. And it's just kind of like a record-keeping ease of play thing. I mean, one of the other things to keep in mind, in 1st edition and 2nd edition, the Windlings, for example, we're going to talk about here in a minute, had a maximum karma pool of 60, and that was regardless of what circle they were until they got the bonus depending on their discipline at high circle. But they had 60 potential karma points if their pool was full. In 4th edition, they have to be a 10th circle character in order to have that much, and 10th circle characters are thin on the ground. You know, so even the Windlings, who are the highest karma using and abusing characters in the game, in 4th edition have they have more per day than an equivalent circle character of another race, but they're still like, even the Windling cavalryman in our online game, who is I think 6 circle now, has 36 karma per day, which when he's spending it on attack tests and damage tests, and has the ability, because of his like 5th circle cavalryman ability, to spend actually multiple points of karma on some tests. It can be drained relatively quickly. So I think there is a certain amount of it can promote in some cases maybe an alpha strike mentality, where you dump that karma like early in the fight to maybe try and get enough of an advantage that you can take the opponent out before they drain you. But that doesn't work. And it works great maybe against like singular large opponents. Doesn't work so well against groups.
No, I tend to save my karma until the very, very end. I'm just kind of like, if I don't hit, okay, fine. I'll use some karma now to make sure I hit.
Yeah, I
tend to see if I can do it first.
I tend to save mine for when I feel it is better to get that extra edge of 3 or 4 extra points on the roll. So
maybe there.
Yeah, like, anyway. So that's, again, I don't think that there was anything wrong with the previous iterations of it. I understand what the goal was as far as the design philosophy. And, we're trying a little bit something different. And
well, I think this is the evolution of karma as a whole.
Yeah.
Because as you said, from the first edition, we get why it was created and exactly the cost of it, and that you had to earn it, and it was a slow earn. But the cost changing into 3rd edition was all, okay, everyone is 10 points now. That's it. Easy math, easy record keeping. It's 10, not 6, not 8, not whatever. 10. Great. So that evolution happened there. And then this evolution to 4th edition, we won't even discuss 5th edition because it's never going to happen.
It's not going to happen soon. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. Josh just had a heart attack or a small stroke. No, so I think in 4th edition, the evolution to how karma can be used and that it doesn't cost anything. Your pool is based upon your circle.
That was basically from 3rd edition. It just got rid of Karma Ritual as a separate talent. It's now basically rolls that as part of your circle abilities in the same way that we kind of did with durability, because it was one of those things that everybody needs to have, and everybody generally tends to have at roughly equivalent to their circle, except for the outliers who would dump a whole bunch of points into it for one reason or another. But like beyond a certain point, if you had Karma Ritual as the basis for how many you could spend, there was a practical limit, really. Like, you didn't need to really buy it above a certain point for, to a certain extent. And that was also something that we were kind of looking at is, are there places where talents, like, there wasn't really any sense of getting it above a certain point because the effect of what you could do with it topped out, and so, that was something else that we looked at, and that's a completely other like thread of discussion, but like looking at places and saying, okay, we want people to have a reason to increase their stuff, maybe beyond even just, I get to roll bigger dice for it, but to have those ranks have a greater effect. So there was a lot of like that under the hood thinking and looking at stuff, and a lot of it was like looking, because 3rd edition was in some ways a fairly drastic change to some of the underlying design choices, and there were consequences of those that were not recognized at the initial development of those. And 4th edition like went to that and said, okay, this isn't working. How can we fix that problem? And whatnot.
Yeah,
so that's that.
So like I said, I think, and the other sell I got to use with my group converting over to 4th edition was, by the way, you get one more talent of you actually doing stuff versus the talent of Karma Ritual now just goes away and it's automatic every day.
Right.
Ta-da. So you have one more actual usable talent in there. So like I said, this is I think the peak of the evolution of where karma ritual, your karma pool, all kind of came to a head and said, 4th edition, we're done. This is it. This is how it's going to work from now on. The only question I have is, since you brought it up earlier, is what was the decision behind changing the karma die from the racial die to just a flat D6 for everybody?
Well, since we weren't
remember.
the ones that actually made that decision, I think, if I can recall, because that was back in the 3rd edition design, which I wasn't heavily involved with, one of the things that was done in the sort of analysis of the various talents in the game was to look at, one, how the talent rank could be useful, could be used to determine something, and to try and avoid situations where the rank would end up having multiple effects. The most notorious offender of this in 1st edition was Taunt, where the rank of the talent not only determined the penalty, but also how long it lasted. And that double dipping could be really, really nasty. And so it was, okay, if we are going to change things so that the karma ritual rank determines not how quickly you can restore your pool, but how much karma you have, then where are we going to what is going to determine that? And obviously going with it as a straight, your karma ritual rank is your karma pool, is a bad idea, because that gives you very, very few karma points.
Yes.
Okay, well then we need to have a multiplier of some sort. What's the multiplier? And I don't know if this is actually what was going on, but I'm just kind of thinking through like the design process that I probably would have come up with on this.
That's fair.
Is like, okay, so we need to have a multiplier. Well, we know that certain races have, are more or less magical. That is somewhat based on their relative attribute, strength or weakness. So let's have the multiplier be based on race, so that the Windlings end up with more karma points. But if we are using that racial modifier to determine the pool size, maybe it shouldn't also determine the die type. I think that there was probably like trying to avoid the double dipping idea.
Fair, because if Windlings had 60 points as a max,
right,
and they also had a D12 for their, it was a D12, D10 for their karma die.
It was a D10 for Windlings.
Thank you.
It was a step
then
6. It was a step 6, which is why their karma multiplier was 6.
Right. I always misremember the D12 because I remember it was based upon size. So Obsidian and Trolls had like a D4, and humans had a D6, and Windlings had a D10.
Humans had
so
humans had a D8 actually, because that was
D8,
the net zero. Obsidian and Trolls were a D4. Tiskrang and elves and dwarves were a D6 because they were all a net +3.
Right.
Humans and orcs had a D8 because they were a net +0. And Windlings were a D10 because they were a net -3 to their total attribute scores.
Right.
That was the basis for it.
No, fair. I always have to look at the chart for those.
Yeah.
But I agree with you that if they could double dip, then yes, the Windlings get to roll, say, if they're, they could roll multiple dice or spend multiple karma points, they get to roll 3 or 4 10s, and someone else got to roll 3 or 4 6s. That's a little advantageous more on the Windling side.
In first edition, there were very, very few places where multiple karma could be spent. But if you were in a situation where you had multiple tests and you could spend a point of karma on each test, for example, the Beastmaster Claw Frenzy, where each attack test would have its own roll and could have a point of karma spent, and each damage test was claw shape, which therefore could have a point of karma spent. It made the Windling Beastmaster with Claw Frenzy an absolute beast, because they're suddenly adding multiple, like they could drain their karma pool in just a couple of flurries of attacks, but they're doing a huge amount. And there are other things that were going on with Claw Shape there and whatnot that just Claw Frenzy was another of those that was like, okay, which is why it was kind of scaled back a little bit in terms of what it could do. But we'll talk about that when we get to Beastmaster.
Yeah, and I think Shot from Archers had acquired karma.
True Shot was the only talent that I can recall offhand where multiple karma could be spent on a single test, and it was an archer talent where you had to spend at least one, but you could spend up to your character's rank in true shot in additional karma. And if you decided before you made the initial roll, and if you failed that initial test and you still had karma available on that limit to spend, then you could continue to spend karma 1 point at a time, either until you hit that limit or you hit.
Yes.
And so it is, I think, offhand, one of the only talents in first edition Earth Dawn that allowed you explicitly spend multiple points of karma on a single test. And so anyway, that was that.
No, my memory's the same because for the Windling Archer it would be here's a D10, here's a D10, here's a D10, and for anybody else it's D6. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, the drawback of that is that once you got that excellent success for the armor defeating hit in first edition, it didn't do anything more for you. It just meant it didn't reduce it by armor. It didn't boost your damage at all.
Yes.
Beyond overcoming the armor. And so Windlings would have a problem with that in terms of their potential damage output as an archer because of that. And again, that's like a whole other discipline, philosophy, design approach.
Or to quote Alton Brown, that's another show.
Yeah, that is another show.
Since we're talking enough about Windlings, how about let's just break into Windlings.
Let's just break into Windlings, because we're like 45 minutes now, and we'll wrap up with Windlings, and we'll bump the other timeline segment to another show
next time. Yeah. So my favorite thing about Windlings is every time I would introduce a Windling, either NPC or someone would play a PC, is my players always thought that Windlings were about the size of like a sprite, 6 or 7 inches tall, like an action figure.
Right.
And I had to point out to them again, I said, no, they're roughly 14, 16, 18 inches tall.
Yeah, about a foot and a half.
Yeah, my daughter bought me for Christmas one year an 18-inch singing Freddie Mercury doll, and it was exactly 18 inches tall. And
it's a Windling troubadour,
as flamboyant as a Windling should be, because it's Freddie Mercury, and I'm a big fan. So I would have to get that doll out occasionally and put it on the table as we're playing to say, this is the size that you're looking at.
Yeah.
And if he's hiding somewhere in the bar, I would have to go hide it somewhere in the room and just say, he can see you. You can see him. He's not, 3 inches tall like a Star Wars action figure. This is 1.5 feet. He's bigger than Barbie.
I mean, they're small, but they're not tiny.
No, and that was the thing. So I had an actual physical representation of an 18-inch doll that I could say, hey, here you go. This is it. This is what you're looking at. And this wave of, would hit their faces. And I'm like, yeah. So don't think they're, an action figure you can put in your pocket. No. Even if you're a troll, you can't fit them in your pocket. Not going to happen. So that's where I start with my Windling introduction. But other than that, I love that they're one of the only races that can actually fly, and that they have a kind of a camouflage technique unbeknownst, I can't say uncontrollable to them, that once they're in a different setting for about a week or two, sometimes 3, that their hair can change. And
I wouldn't say that it's a
camouflage
technique so much as it's a they are a highly magical race. I mean, the fact that you've got an 18-inch tall person with basically like dragonfly or butterfly wings that can fly, it's obviously magical in the first place. So there's obviously that, but also then, as opposed to most people where you have the hair and skin color and such that you're born with, Windlings, and this isn't, depending on the group, this doesn't get played up too much, but Windlings, after settling down in a particular place for a certain amount of time, will have their hair and skin color change to reflect the brightest elements of that new home. And so I don't think it has no actual, it does not have any camouflaging or hiding effects, but basically they will have bright orange hair maybe to reflect the terracotta roof tiles of the city that they live in. Or if they're in a mountain area, their skin might be really bright ice, ice under the sun white, kind of that sort of thing. And so Like, it does not offer any kind of camouflage thing.
I chose the wrong word.
It's a really cool like aspect of them as a race. Windlings are I think we chose to do them first because they do hold a special place in the hearts one way or the other of the Earth Dawn fan base. Yes. I really like Windlings. Generally speaking, people either really, really like Windlings or they don't like them.
There's not a lot of gray area.
Yeah.
In most fans, they either really love them or they really hate them.
And I think part of that has to do perhaps with the presentation of them in first edition and the in some respects, and the type of player that is typically drawn to them as a race, that they can very quickly that in the wrong hands they can very quickly become a Kender type problem.
I was gonna use that exact analogy.
Yeah, where they can potentially come across as very like mischievous and disruptive and childlike and problematic and stuff and
annoyance
and annoying and things like that. And so there's that, and so you either end up with like the really bizarre, disruptive, Kendery, like flying whatever, problem, or people tend to like play Windlings who stand in opposition to that, which is to say like very, very serious and dour and like, very like not talkative or don't apparently have any kind of sense of humor and stuff like that. And we have one of each in our online game. We've got a Windling illusionist who is very like bizarre and out there, and like kind of a goofy comic reliefy type character. And then we've got the Windling cavalryman who is very like, speaks in grunts and does not tend to display much emotion at all, and is a very like serious and direct killing machine. Both of which are valid, but there is, just like with any other individual, an entire range of stuff that you can do with Windlings.
Yes, the main personality trait I skimmed through again, and that I've always remembered as well, is they love everything new and anything interesting.
Yes.
And so that they are always curious, which is where people get that childlike sense of wonder about them. And they tend to play them, when they know that personality trait, they tend to play them more childlike and curious and disruptive. And I'm like, no, they are curious and they are interested.
Yeah,
because they mature at 30, so they're not 7 years old.
Right. I mean, 30. It is possible to be curious and have a sense of wonder about things without being stupid about it or careless about it. And that's I think that is the aspect that gives Windlings the bad name, or gives the bad reputation in certain circles, is that there's the tendency for, they are curious and like love anything new, therefore they will like do
have a child.
Like have a senseless, like, I mean, it's fine to have a childlike sense of wonder. I try to have a childlike sense of wonder about stuff, but by the same token, like, hey, this fire is pretty, I'm gonna completely disregard the fact that it will hurt me if I go and deal with it. And there's a lot of the to kind of put it in D&D terms, like really low wisdom Windlings, who don't have the sense God gave a turnip. To pull out a colloquialism, that seem to live to cause headaches for the rest of their group, and there's a place for that, but I can certainly understand how it gets old.
Yeah, I agree, because there was nothing that I can recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, because your knowledge is more recent than mine, about a mischievous streak, which is it gets to be the annoying part if people choose to roleplay that, because I always looked at it as they're curious, they like things that are new, but they're not out to cause trouble, but they are quick-witted, and they like an insult fight, and they like to tease people, and so they are very fast of tongue, which is why they get along with the Tiskrang so very well. They are very flashy, they like the attention, but they're not to the point where they're honestly just going to, turn people away.
Yeah, well, I think part of the reputation comes from the Windling quote from the first edition book, where each race, as they're describing the various races, has a quote that kind of encapsulates that's supposed to sort of encapsulate their philosophy and approach. And the Windling code is "we." And it, and it's basically like, it's this Windling thief who stole a dagger from, that basically, the idea that, it's this thief who stole a dagger from a troll, and the troll code is basically the guy that he stole it from, basically talking about how it's better to just pop their heads off. That interaction and that presentation early on, and the fact that the only Windling archetype in the first edition book was the Windling thief, that, there is...
That sold them a little short.
Yeah. So, I completely understand, in some ways I can understand why people have reservations about them. I think some of the, anti-Windling hate is meant in good humor. But I also know of, some tables where game masters will not allow Windlings as player characters at all, and won't even have, I don't think... some have gone so far as to not even actually have Windlings in their game.
Well, that's just not fair.
Yeah. I mean, again, do what you want at your own table. But that's a kind of again, it's that Kender problem hugely magnified.
Agreed.
So
I'm trying to, as the survival guide, convince people to, yes, give Windlings a second chance if you haven't in a while, or really let's try and nail down exactly what Windlings are and are not. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that so far. The other thing I get to sell people on with Windlings is one of two different things. Actually, three different things. One is there was an article in one of the Earthdawn journals many, many years ago, which are Windlings too powerful because they make great spellcasters?
That was one of the things that I did want to talk about with regards to the Windling, which was to talk a little bit about the mechanical side of things. But yeah, go ahead. You were saying about that.
And then the second one is that Windlings, if you play them right and if you can survive all the adventures, their lifespan is up to 170, 175 years old. So they're not going to, be in and out and done quickly like an orc. Orc's maximum lifespan is 40 or 45. Right. So you can have an aged Windling who still has that curiosity, but it's more scholarly than it is childlike. And so, like I said, they mature at age 30. And then they're allowed out into the world. And so from 30 to 170, that's a long, long time in there. They have wonder about the world. They are curious. They are fascinated. They have this awe about certain things that you should have some awe for, but they're not children and they're not, mischievous little punks. Yeah. So that's my second one. My third one is, and we've kind of glossed over this because we haven't mentioned it at all, is Windlings get something nobody else gets other than maybe dragons, I think, which is astral sight.
Yes. Yeah. So we're getting it sort of leading into the mechanical aspect of things. The astral sight, Windlings, any Windling character has the ability. Now, in first edition, it was just simply a trait that they had. That they all had astral sight. It was just basically a straight perception roll, and that was it. They couldn't really increase it. There were differences in the different types of astral sight that you had in first edition, and each of them supposedly had advantages and disadvantages and stuff like that. Again, I understand what was being done there.
Yes,
but as someone who revised and rewrote and tried to consolidate the rules on astral vision and whatnot for the compendia, the classic edition, there were several headaches and issues that came about as a result of that. Windlings now have the option, much like humans have the ability to take versatility as a talent that allows them to take advantage of their racial thing. Windlings have the ability to pick up Astral Sight as a racial talent, which means that they spend legend points to increase its rank, and if they want to, they can increase it higher. I think one thing that I would do differently, and I would actually even perhaps allow this as a house rule, and recommend it as a house rule for most tables, is, as it's sort of written right now, if a Windling does not take any ranks in their racial Astral Sight talent, they can't use it. I would allow a Windling to do Astral Sight as a straight perception, so that they can still do that thing that they did before, but if they want to get better at it, they'll need to spend points basically honing that ability. I think I would actually, I would certainly allow that, and probably at my own table, if I were running it, allow that as an ability that a Windling, they would have to spend a point of strain the same way that anybody who is using the talent would, but they could do it without needing to actually get ranks and just roll a straight perception. Because, to be honest, straight perception is not, occasionally you get lucky with an explosion, but it's, it still allows every Windling to do what they could do previously, but does also give them the option to improve it if they want. And then, obviously, any spellcaster or whatnot that has the ability, or any other discipline that has the ability to pick up Astral Sight as a talent, they can certainly do that as well. But I think that's probably something that I would do slightly differently, if, thinking back on it now. So that's really useful. Dragons also have that ability to see astrally, which is something that can come in very handy. If you have a game master who is willing to provide information that is only available. And that's something I think we can probably stick a pin in to talk about down the road in a later episode, is dealing with Astral Sight and advice for a game master on what you can do with it. But it's a cool ability. They also obviously get the ability to fly, which is great, but is also, I think, part of a reason why they might give game masters headaches, is that a character that can more or less fly with impunity, which isn't actually the case with the Windlings, but a character that can fly drastically changes the tactical situations that you can put the group in, which is part of the reason why Windling spellcasters and archers are so effective, is because they can fly and effectively get out of the range of any melee or close combat attacks from the enemy. And so the only way to deal with them is to have either flying opponents or ranged opponents to be able to go after them. The downside of that is that, one, Windlings aren't really designed to fly all the time. They can fly for relatively short periods of time. Flying for more than about 15 to 20 minutes requires them to, they basically start taking strain from the effort of that. So they can fly during the course of a combat, but during a long overland journey, most of the time they're going to be riding on someone's shoulder or on the back of a pony or whatever, just kind of hitching a ride on whatever they can. They also cannot fly in the rain. If it is raining out, their wings get wet and are too fragile to carry them aloft. So that is another thing, anytime we don't want, anytime we want to ground the Windling, we're just going to have it be bad weather. I am generally of the opinion, if your players are making characters that have abilities, it's because they want to use them, and you should take that into account in your adventure design and give them opportunities for those abilities to be awesome. Just in general. And that if somebody is playing a Windling, they will be able to fly, and you need to take that into account and maybe have some things that are, for the Windling to take advantage of that. But also on the flip side, if there's only one Windling in the group and it's the only person that can fly and they go off on their own, they're off on their own. And there are some downsides to that because, Windlings are small, and they do get a bonus to their physical defense as a result of that, making them harder to hit, which is, again, another thing that makes them really useful as spellcasters. Really good as spellcasters, because spellcasters tend to have a lower dexterity and thus physical defense normally. Windlings make up for that with their racial bonus. And it also means that it's harder for archers or, whatever to try and pick them off when they're hovering out of range and being annoying. Annoying in the sense that they're continuing to pepper you with spells as opposed to, whatever.
And you're getting frustrated, not annoyed with them. How's that?
Yeah. I mean, and on top of that, Windlings do get a little bit of a bonus, bonus to dexterity. Their dexterity is slightly higher compared to the baseline human, so they already will have even a little bit more of an advantage as far as their physical defense goes that way. They have a bonus to perception, which gives them a little bit of an edge when it comes to being a spellcaster and having a higher mystic defense. And
I found actually that's based on sense of smell.
Okay. Yeah. In the book, it does talk about them.
Yeah.
About them having a good sense of smell. Again, as sort of magical, like awakened bird/insect kind of things. That I mean, it makes sense. It's cool. It's again something now that you mentioned. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that, but it doesn't get doesn't get brought up very well. That's a whole like storytelling. Oh, you should engage all of your senses kind of thing. And then they also get a bonus. They actually get a +2 bonus as opposed to a +1, but it's a +2 bonus to charisma, which gives them higher social defense. So they get bonuses in all 3 of the defense categories. The +2 to charisma makes them good troubadours or beastmasters, because beastmasters' charisma is an important ability.
Absolutely.
It makes them pretty good cavalrymen, again, because of the charisma and the dexterity bonuses. So like there are several things that Windlings can be really good at. The downside of Windlings is they get pretty hefty penalties to strength. They have a net -6 to their strength attribute. It's no longer
a strength maximum only. They can only ever have a maximum.
They did have a strength. They did have a strength max in previous editions. In much the same way that, at least in sort of the base rules as presented, we've done away with the hard line, oh, you cannot, like, these races cannot follow this discipline.
Yes.
Those are more like now kind of setting-based role-playing guidelines. But the fact that Windlings basically have a net -6 strength means, you're still not going to end up having a high strength. Effectively,
no, it's going to cost you a lot to get up to your max 12.
Yeah, you're right. Well, it was that I think like the original Windling max strength was like 14 before you applied their racial modifier, so their net maximum was like a 7 or an 8 or something like that. But effectively, they are going to be 2 steps lower on their strength than a human who spends the same number of points on strength. Yes. That's not nothing. And so that is the drawback when it comes to maybe looking at more combat-oriented disciplines like archer, like swordmaster, both of which or warrior, any of those which take advantage of would be taking advantage of the Windlings' slightly higher strength and physical defense bonus, but because of the way that some talents are structured, like Claw Shape for Beastmaster or Charge for the Cavalrymen, or Downstrike, which I think, I don't even remember now which damage boosting talent ended up where. But basically any talent where you can spend ranks to increase the amount of damage that you're doing, like with Claw Shape and whatnot, that allows you to overcome the strength penalty that Windlings have. In addition, because it's a talent, it allows them to bring their karma to bear.
Yes.
They also get a little bit of a penalty to their toughness. It's -2, but that's the same penalty as an elf gets compared to a human. So relatively speaking, Windlings are a little bit less durable than than the sort of baseline human or other sort of races in that area. But it's not the big downside that that strength is. Like strength is the really big like sticking point when it comes to them. For a Windling on their toughness, you're looking at the same sort of thing that you would for an elf, which is to say early on, if you're playing a character that's going to be mixing it up in close combat, you're going to need to be careful. Windlings have the slight edge in that they are a little bit harder to hit with their physical defense bonus.
Yep.
But if you are playing like a cavalryman or a swordmaster or a warrior or something like that as a Windling, your durability ends up making up for the slightly lower health attributes that you'll start off with. Although you will end up probably with a little bit fewer recovery tests and your wound threshold will be a little bit lower. So you do still need to be a little bit careful especially when it comes to suffering wounds, because as we discussed last time, your ability to avoid knockdown is based on strength, and Windlings have a hard time with that.
And knockdown does include getting knocked out of the air.
And yeah, it does include getting knocked out of the air. So that's a bad situation. But Windlings have the highest karma of any of the races. Their karma modifier in 4th edition is 6, which means they get 6 times their circle in their karma pool, which is nothing to sneeze at. Even though it is only a D6 as opposed to a D10 from earlier editions, having more points available, is generally a good thing. And Windlings will do their utmost. Basically, you bring that to bear when you can. Again, looking at like Claw Shape for Beastmasters or Charge for Cavalrymen, where those are talents that boost damage. That's where you throw your karma in order to get the little bit of a higher damage result.
Well, and as we've said, so apparently we've made a nice little number of selling points here to play a Windling. Every single Windling I've ever had in my game that I game mastered, their physical defense starts off at, I swear to you, a 12 almost every single time. And so since you're saying 8 or 9... Yeah, 8 or 9 is a nice average. 12 is usually the starting point for the physical defense for Windlings. So
yeah, 10 or 11 or 12, depending on the discipline.
Yes.
Like if you're playing a Windling Troubadour, for example, you're probably not going to see a 12 as your physical defense, just because you're going to be likely spending the points in your charisma and perception. But as a Windling Troubadour, you also really don't need to worry about strength much at all. So you can probably put the points into boosting your dexterity. But yeah, Windlings, having dexterities in the, starting as a first circle character, even a non-combat type in the 9 or 10, which is typically where your other races are going to be with their combat disciplines. Yeah. Is nothing to sneeze at. And so, you do need to be a little bit careful as a Windling, especially in early circles, because it will not take as much to take you out of a fight. But you do have some tools that allow you to get around that, with the flight, so you can stay out of range, and the increased physical defense that make your and Windlings are fast too,
and
when
they're
flying,
so they can seek cover. So the cover rules is a whole combat option later on, but there are many advantages to playing a Windling or allowing them in your game, because again, if you need people to bite the hook that the game master is feeding you, have a Windling in the party. They will be interested, and they will take you up on that more often than not.
The flip side of that is, there are a lot of advantages mechanically to playing a Windling, and there are a lot of like really cool role playing opportunities and stuff that you can do as a Windling. The one caution that I would say is, make them a character, not a caricature.
Oh, lovely said. Well said.
Like, think of them as a person that has, desires and goals and personality, and there are certain broad cultural and racial like patterns that emerge, but don't make a character that's like unless this is the sort of thing that your group is into, don't make a character whose only goal is to just cause grief for everybody else in the group, because you start to get to the point where you would be asking, why would they continue to put up with this person?
Yeah, don't be that jackass. Yeah.
Again, like looking at the idea of role playing as a collective activity, that there's absolutely can have fun playing a more happy-go-lucky, curious type, but you also don't want to necessarily do that at the expense of other people's fun. And so sort of the session 0 discussion and the ongoing discussions that should be going on, checking in with your fellow players to make sure that everything is kind of okay, and you're not getting this kind of resentment that ends up coming out in play, and to distinguish your characters from the players and stuff like that. Just in general, don't be a jerk.
Which is good in all aspects of life.
Yeah, that's a good. But Windling players and Windling characters have a reputation for veering into that jerky territory more often, And the defense of, oh, I'm just playing my character is tired and old and really is just a way to excuse being a jerk to your fellow players and to excuse like crapping all over their fun.
Hear, hear.
Not that I mean, again, whatever, in the grand scheme of things, whatever works for you and your group and what's going on at your table. Hey, if the players are all, laughing
on
hysterically and clearly having a good time at your Windling basically being a mobile force of chaos, fantastic. Like, that's awesome. But also, if you get to be the situation where the other players are starting to resent that and it's maybe coming across as one note, again, you're getting into the, like, be adults,
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I got no comments on that. So we hope we have convinced you to give Windlings a second or third glance, or at least an aspect
or even a
using them.
first try.
Even a first try for those of you who are resistant to ever looking at them again. So yeah, we've covered on this one. What did we cover? We covered success levels and karma, the changes to karma. We have done the derived stats for the breakpoint on your attributes, and all of that fed into the grand thing that is the Windlings as a playable race in the Earth Dawn role-playing game. Any edition, really.
Any edition.
So,
yep.
Yes. So that really, we're an hour and 15 minutes in, so we should probably wrap this up. That does cover us for this episode. We do want to hear anything more from you in depth about the pronunciation guide from a couple of episodes ago to how you do or do not like Windlings. So by all means, drop us a line, either on the Facebook page or the EDSG podcast at gmail.com email address. We would love to hear from you. Josh checks the box more frequently, but he does forward everything on to me as well. So we do collaborate on anything we're going to talk about. But otherwise, folks, I thank Josh again for his time and being active on the forums and keeping the Earth on flame burning for all of us. So any final thoughts?
No, not really. Just like I thank you all for continuing to play and support the game. It certainly would not be possible without you. So that's, it goes both ways. Like I appreciate the thanks for keeping things going, but I keep things going because people support it. So
absolutely,
it's a big old circle of life.
We love it. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everybody. And now, so go make a Windling and go make your own legend.